the world did not stop. It kept turning, breathing, laughing, and crying. What stopped was me, Evelyn Cross. My last memory is the smell of rain and wet earth and a bright light in my eyes. The noise. The last sound I heard was the blare of a horn. And then silence. The world did not stop. It kept turning, breathing, laughing, and crying. What stopped was me, Evelyn Cross. My last memory is the smell of rain and wet earth, and now, silence. A silence that does not exist in life. The only thing left to me was my presence, and the weight of the choices that brought me here. There was no tunnel of light, no angelic voices, no sudden promised peace. The last thing I felt was the rupture. Not a sharp pain, but the sensation of fabric tearing, of a silver cord breaking. In a millisecond stretched into an eternity, I saw everything and saw nothing. The glare of the headlights, a blur of blinding light. The image of a flower bed I had never noticed before. The wet shimmer of asphalt reflecting a sky painted in violet tones. And the sound that swallowed me, was a guttural scream that I now realize was my own. It was not of fear, but of absolute surprise, the disbelief that the end could be so sudden, so banal. And then, silence. It was a silence unlike any other. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of the very possibility of sound. I floated. I had no weight, no body, no sensation of air against skin. I was only consciousness. A consciousness suspended above the scene of my own death, a ghost in a film that refused to stop rolling. Beneath me, a body lay in the puddle left by the afternoon rain. Copper-colored hair spread like a broken halo over the dark water. Skin, once vibrant, now had the pallor of a winter flower. I recognized my own face. And the sight did not bring me horror, but a deep and distant sorrow, as if I were witnessing the death of a stranger. For a moment, I tried to return. I tried to touch the body, to feel the pain it felt, but my hands passed through it like smoke through the wind. I was a memory, and the body, a reminder that life had gone on without me. It is strange how death offers a brutal clarity. In my last breath, I did not think of lost loves or monumental regrets. I thought of small, sharp things, like shards of glass. The coffee cup I had left on the kitchen table, the electricity bill I had to pay the next morning, the promise to visit my mother that I had postponed once again. And beneath it all, the echo of a void I had carried for so long. The feeling that I had never truly lived, only existed, just occupied space. The weight of my choices was not of great moral failures, but of a life of omissions, of paths not taken, of words never spoken. I felt like a specter in a city that refused to see me. A stranger watching as the paramedics arrived, lights flashing, the terrified face of a man behind the wheel of the car that had collided with mine. He was alive. He saw me, or at least the body, and I, for a moment, wished he could feel what I felt. Not the pain of impact, but the cold loneliness of being a shadow in a world that continues to make noise. I became a ghost, so that others could remain whole. A soft, undeniable pull, like an invisible current, began to draw me away from the scene of the accident. It was not violent, but it was unchangeable, as though the gravity of life had lost its hold on me, and now a new and unknown force was calling me. I moved upward, away from the red and blue lights, the distant sirens, the tears of a stranger. The vision of the world below became a blur of colors, a tapestry of memories I had left behind. The smell of rain and wet earth faded. The sound of sirens vanished. I was only consciousness, a naked soul, being pulled toward the unknown. Not toward the promised light, but into a new and strange form of existence, where the only thing I knew for certain was that I had died. And what came next was the most mysterious of all questions. The pull that tore me away from the scene of my own death was not a plunge into the abyss, but an ascension into a luminosity that did not blind. There was no sun, no moon, no stars. The light was omnipresent, an ethereal mist that seemed to emanate from every particle of the air. It was a light that did not warm nor illuminate objects, for there were no objects, only a vast and silent sea of time and space. The ground beneath my feet, which I could not feel, seemed made of an opaque crystal that reflected the light softly, without brilliance. And the silence, which before had been an absence, was now a crushing presence, a mute hymn filling the void. My consciousness, which I believed to be the only thing intact, began to expand. And with this expansion came perception. I was not alone. Around me, drifting like fragments of shattered stained glass, were other consciousnesses. They had no form, no face, no eyes. They were only fragments of light, some glowing with gentle energy, others with a gray melancholy. They moved in random patterns, like dust particles caught in a beam of light, each on its own silent, solitary journey. I tried to approach one of them. My intention, pure and immediate, was to ask what this place was. But the fragment drifted away, not in fear, but with a polite indifference, like a musical note that refuses to join the melody of another. Then I understood. In that plane there was no touch, no voice, no sound. Communication was emanation. If I wanted to be heard, I had to radiate the thought. Where am I? I thought, directing the intention toward the nearest fragment of light. The answer came not as words, but as an image, a feeling. I saw a river of memories, a constant flow of lives that had ended, each one a drop of water in the ocean of eternity. The fragment of light was one of them, a drop, and I, another. Death was not an end, but an entrance into that river. My own mind, still tethered to the world of the living, was an anomaly. The memories of my past were sharp anchors holding me down. I saw flashes of an argument, the cold glow of a computer screen, my mother's face distorted by worry. I still felt the urge to return, to fix what I had left unfinished, to close the doors I had left open. It was this restlessness, this turbulence, that set me apart from the others. While they drifted in silent resignation, I trembled, a dissonant note in a symphony of peace. Is this what happens to everyone? I thought, the question a voiceless scream. And the response that formed within me was that not all were like this. Some souls followed a different path, a purpose. Some were sent back, guided. But most, like the fragments around me, simply waited for something I could not yet comprehend. It was in that moment of deep loneliness and confusion that my presence, my turbulence, was noticed. I did not hear a sound, but felt a change in the atmosphere, as if the light had grown denser, more alive. And a form, a mass of light more concentrated and pure than the others, began to approach. It was different. It was not a fragment, but a totality. Not a drop of water, but the river itself. It moved with purpose, with a gravity that seemed to draw everything around it closer. The restlessness I felt, the doubts that haunted me, all seemed to draw it near. It was a beacon, and I was a lost ship in the sea of eternity. I did not know if it was an angel, a guide, or something far older. All I knew, in the vastness of that plane, was that my journey had not ended the moment my body stopped. It had only begun. And the being of light approaching seemed to hold the answers to questions I did not yet know how to ask. The mass of light did not approach with the speed of an arrow, but with the inexorable stillness of a tide. Its form, as it grew more defined, was not that of a human body, but of a spiral of energy pulsing with colors I had never seen in life. It had no eyes, yet its presence made me feel seen. It had no mouth, yet a symphony of emotions, complex and ancient, emanated from it, enveloping me like a dense mist. There was the serenity of mountains, the depth of oceans, and the wisdom of ages I could never hope to comprehend. I, who felt like a dissonant note, realized it was the melody itself. The communication was not verbal, but a gentle invasion into my consciousness. It was as if the entity were reading an open book, a book that was my very soul. There was no judgment, only a neutral and complete observation. In a fraction of a second, I relived flashes of my life, not as tender memories, but as fragments of evidence. The entity was examining the source of my unrest, my persistent attachment to the world of the living. I saw the image of an argument, the sharp words I never took back. I saw the door of my house closing as I rushed off to work, without giving the embrace I knew my mother wanted. And I saw painfully the emptiness of my own living room, the silence I filled with work and distractions, avoiding the confrontation with the loneliness that consumed me. It was not the entity that showed me these moments. It only illuminated the dark corners of my soul, allowing me to see them with a clarity I had lacked in life. And with each fragment, a sensation emanated from the spiral of light. Not pity, but recognition. It understood. It understood that my unrest was not a flaw, but the consequence of a life shaped by fear rather than intention. Suddenly, the reading stopped. The spiral of light focused, and a new feeling, one I had not experienced in a long time, enveloped me. The feeling of being understood. The entity did not care about failures, but about the honesty of the pain they caused. Most souls, like the fragments drifting around me, dissolve into the vast peace of eternity because they let go. They release their fears, their loves, their regrets. But I had not. I clung to them like a shipwrecked soul clinging to a piece of wood. And it was this inability to let go, this imperfection, that made me different in that plane. The entity, in its infinite, silent wisdom, revealed an image. Not of me, but of a man in a dark room, seated in a rocking chair, holding a book he could not read. The image was not clear, but his pain was palpable. I felt his sorrow as if it were my own, an ancient weight of loss and despair. And I realized that my unrest was not only mine, it was the capacity to feel the pain of others. My imperfection was, in truth, a gift. The spiral of light moved in a pattern that made me feel the word possibility. My soul, so tethered to earth and its emotions, was not meant to dissolve into the vastness of that plane. There was a breach, a purpose only a soul like mine could fulfill. The silence, once a mute hymn, now seemed to hold a question meant only for me. The entity did not need my verbal response, only my intent. And as the image of the sorrowful man faded, the only thing I could feel was a burning desire to act, to use this newfound capacity. I was not a ghost by accident. I was a shadow in a world of light, and that was my function. And the being before me, in its luminous form, had a mission for me. A mission that would give meaning to my death. A mission that would grant new purpose to my eternal life. The symphony of emotions from the being of light became clearer, more focused. The spiral of energy intensified, and a wave of information, not words, but a continuous flow of visions and feelings, flooded my consciousness. I felt like a sponge, absorbing ancient truths and instructions that seemed to be the very foundation of existence itself. The entity did not speak, but it showed me. And what it showed was the universe of possibilities lying on the threshold between life and death. The mission, I understood, was not one of saving or intervening in some grandiose way. I would not be an angel with wings, nor a messianic figure. My role was subtler, more intimate. I was to become a guide, a shadow dancing between light and darkness. My purpose was to return to Earth and draw near to souls standing at a point of inflection, an existential crossroads. People on the verge of making a choice that would lead them to ruin or to redemption, who needed only a reflection, a gentle nudge toward compassion and self-awareness. My task was to be a mirror, reflecting back to them the light within themselves, or the shadow they needed to confront. The being of light showed me how this would be possible. My unrest, my inability to release life, was not a weakness, but my tool. The weight of my choices and regrets was what gave me the ability to feel the pain of the living. My own life experience was not a burden, but my compass. I would connect with these souls through emotion, through the echo of their inner conflicts. I would not need to speak, nor to touch. My mere presence, the emanation of my consciousness, would be enough to create resonance, a subtle influence that would turn their gaze inward. The revelation was overwhelming. On one hand, I felt a wave of panic. To return to a world where I would be invisible, a shadow watching a life I could never live again. The idea of being an eternal spectator terrified me. I had not solved my own problems. How could I help others solve theirs? The hypocrisy of my new existence weighed as heavily as the choices of my past. I was a wounded soul, and my mission was to use that wound as a source of healing for others. The weight of responsibility was immense, but the promise of purpose was irresistible. Eternity would not be an empty silence, but an active journey. I would have a role. Sensing my hesitation, the entity showed me one final image. An image of my own soul, shattering into 1,000 fragments and carried into the river of eternity, dissolving into silence with the others. That was the alternative: peace, stillness, the absence of pain, and the absence of purpose. A peace that I knew would come at the cost of my identity. I would no longer be Evelyn. I would simply be a drop in the ocean. And though fear paralyzed me, the thought of no longer being myself, of being lost in the vastness, was even more terrifying. Your function is to offer compassion, the entity transmitted, the intention soft and clear. Your gift is their free will. The mission was not one of imposition, but of offering, of giving them the chance to choose the light. I looked from the image of my soul dissolving to the image of the sorrowful man in the darkened room. The path before me was not easy, but it was mine. I could not go back, but perhaps I could go forward. And in a moment of clarity that only death can bring, I decided. I lifted my consciousness and released a thought, simple, yet heavy with intent. I accept. The plane of light pulsed in response. The spiral of energy from the being of light enveloped me in a wave of ethereal warmth. Not the warmth of fire, but the warmth of purpose. And I felt my consciousness rearranging, recalibrating. I was being prepared, attuned to the frequency of Earth. The journey back was about to begin, and I, who had left life with a farewell, was about to return with a mission. The transition was not instant. After the silent yes that echoed through my consciousness, the ethereal light of the plane dissolved into a gentle torpor, like a deep, dreamless sleep. There was no tunnel, no portal, only silence, which gradually filled with sound. The first sound I heard was that of a distant siren, a familiar lament that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Then, the muffled murmur of traffic. The smell of rain and wet earth, the same fragrance that had carried me into death, struck me with overwhelming intensity, mingled with the aroma of fresh coffee and the heavy pollution of the city. I was back, but not as I remembered. When my feet touched the asphalt, I did not feel the rough texture, nor the puddle of water. I felt nothing. I looked down and saw my shoes, my legs, the same clothes I had worn, but they seemed translucent, as though made of solid vapor. The sensation was that of being a moving photograph, an image that existed, but had no mass. The cold I felt did not come from the air, but from the profound loneliness of being a soul that did not belong. The first sight was the most painful. I stood on the same street where my life had ended. The wrecked car was gone and the dirty puddle had dried, but the tire marks were still there. Scars on the city's skin. People walked around me, absorbed in their cell phones, umbrellas in hand. I tried to approach a man waiting at the bus stop. I tried to touch his shoulder to see if he would feel a chill, if a fleeting glimpse of me would pass through his mind. But my hand went through his body as if he were made of air. The indifference with which he ignored me wounded me more deeply than any physical pain I had ever felt in life. I was a ghost, a shadow dancing on the stage of life, but one that would never be seen. The weight of my new existence crushed me for a moment. I drifted toward the sidewalks I had walked every day. I passed by my favorite cafe, the smell of coffee and sweet bread filling me with a nostalgia that was almost unbearable. I saw the waiter, a young man with a gentle smile who had served me every morning. He was alive. He was laughing. And I, who had left life with a farewell, had returned, but only as an eternal spectator. I kept walking, my steps weightless. I passed by my building, the same one where I had lived alone, and now it seemed like a strange monument. The light from the window of my old apartment was dark. Someone else lived there now. Another story was being written, and mine, so abruptly interrupted, had become just a footnote in the book of that city. Sorrow consumed me, a sorrow deeper than what I had felt in the plane of light. There, solitude had been universal. Here, it was personal, a cruel reminder of what I had lost. It was as if my soul were screaming, yet the sound could not be heard. I clung to the mission. The promise of a purpose was the only thing holding me together. And then, I felt it. I did not hear a voice, but a pain that was not mine. It came from a specific soul, a beacon of sorrow and despair amid the crowd. It was not like the pain I had felt in the plane of light, that ethereal and universal ache. This pain was real, palpable, a weight clinging to the soul. It was the pain I had been chosen to feel. I turned toward its source. A man sat on a park bench, his hands buried in his face, his back bent under the weight of life. He was broken, yet there was a faint light within him, a spark of hope refusing to die. I knew, with a clarity only my new state could grant me, that he stood at a crossroads, and that my presence could make the difference. With a newfound purpose, I turned away from my past and moved toward him. My journey was no longer about what I had lost, but about what I could give. And I, who had returned to Earth as a ghost, was about to face my first encounter. He was seated on a park bench, his back curved like a bow under the weight of an invisible burden. His winter coat, though clean, seemed wrinkled by sorrow. His hands were buried in his face, hiding an expression I knew all too well, that of a soul that had given up. There were no tears, only the stillness of a deep sadness, of a silence that refused to be broken. He was a beacon of despair amid the indifferent crowd. The world around him kept moving, with laughter and conversation, but he was trapped in his own universe of loneliness. And I, with my new perception, felt that loneliness as if it were my own, a familiar echo of the emptiness I had carried. I approached. This time, not with the innocence and desperation of a lost soul, but with the stillness of purpose. I did not try to touch him, nor whisper words of comfort. Instead, I focused, channeling the intention the being of light had taught me. My consciousness became a wave, and I projected it, not toward him, but within him. The goal was not to invade, but to offer my presence as a subtle mirror, a reflection of what he had forgotten about himself. I used my own sorrow, my grief for leaving the world, as a bridge to his pain, so that he would feel less alone. The effect was not immediate. At first, there was no reaction. He remained still. But I persisted, concentrating with an intensity I never knew I had. I projected myself into him, not to take his pain, but to show him that it was felt, that it was seen. And then, something shifted. I felt a spark, a small, almost imperceptible change in the energy of his soul. The air around me, once gray, shimmered for an instant. He lifted his hands from his face. His eyes were red and swollen, but for the first time they were no longer empty. There was a spark of life in them, a silent question. He looked around, as if he had felt a chill in his soul, searching for the source of that sensation. Of course, he did not see me, but he felt my presence, my influence, like a breeze that carries the promise of rain to dry land. My mission was not to give him a solution. It was not to say go home or call a friend. It was to give him the chance to choose his solution. What he did next was the simplest of acts. He drew a deep breath. Not the air of the city, but a sigh that seemed to come from within, from the part of him that had been dead for so long. He closed his eyes, and a single tear slid down his face. But this tear was not of sorrow. It was a tear of relief, of a soul that had found a drop of water in a desert. He stood, slowly, with a resolve that had not been there before. He looked at the gray sky and then at the people passing by, but this time with renewed presence. He had not been healed. The sadness was still there, a weight on his shoulders, but the oppression had lifted. Now he had the strength to take the next step, to continue his journey. He began to walk, no longer with slumped shoulders, but with a new sense of purpose. And the emotion that flooded me in that moment was the purest, most overwhelming I had ever felt. It was not the joy of requited love, but the satisfaction of a fulfilled purpose. I felt the bond between us dissolve, and my own chest filled with a soft, warm light. I had done something. My death was not the end. My journey, with all its pain, had brought me to a place where I could be useful. I, who had felt so empty in life, was now full. The mission was real, and I was on the right path. After the first encounter, the mission became a routine. I walked the city streets no longer as a lost ghost, but as a hunter of feelings, attuned to the emotional frequencies of the souls around me. I began to recognize pain in a way I never could in life. The despair of a mother at a bus stop, the resignation of an old man on a park bench, the fear of a student hesitating before entering a classroom. For each of these souls, I drew near, offering my presence as an invisible breeze. And the result was always the same. A glimpse of relief, a small act of courage, the decision to take the next step. I was an echo of hope. Yet I began to notice a difference among souls. Some responded to my invisible touch with an almost immediate urgency, as if they had been waiting for that gentle nudge. Their pain, though deep, was like the surface of water yearning to be stirred. And when I projected myself, I could feel the light within them, a latent energy of goodness and resilience that only needed to be acknowledged. I felt like a sculptor, not creating the work of art, but removing the stone so the beauty inside could emerge. But then I encountered the shadow. It was a man at the back of a bar, sitting alone with a bottle of whiskey. The aura of his soul was not sorrow like the others, but a cold and cutting bitterness. He was not merely suffering. He was indulging in his suffering, wielding it as a barrier against the world. I approached, projecting my compassion as I had so many times before. But instead of feeling connected to his pain, I felt repelled. My presence was not a gentle breeze, but an intrusion. The darkness in his soul was a cloak he refused to shed. When I touched him, nothing shifted. Instead, I felt a wave of rejection, an echo of his darkest thoughts. Leave me alone. I deserve this. The experience left me shaken. I withdrew from the bar, confused, burdened by a sense of failure I had not felt since my death. My mission was not a fairy tale where every darkness dissolves with a touch. My light was not a source, but a mirror. I only reflected what already existed. For those who carried even the faintest spark of light, my presence was a beacon. For those who refused to see the light, I was nothing more than another ghost in the dark. That man's bitterness was not the only obstacle. I began to realize that my mission carried its own temptations. Some souls so full of light and goodness drew me in with a pull that was almost addictive. I felt good reflecting their light, and I wanted more. I saw the danger of attachment, of wanting more than my mission allowed me to give. I needed to remain neutral. I had to remember that I was not there to be saved, but to help others save themselves. The lesson was harsh. I was not a heroine. I was a guide. I was not the light. I was the reflection. And my role was only to show the path, never to push someone down it. The free will of the living was the supreme law. With each encounter, I was learning about the delicate dance between light and shadow, and about my role in walking the line between them. That embittered man showed me a brutal truth, that my mission was one of compassion, but compassion is not always accepted. I, who had left life with a void in my soul, was now filled with purpose, but a purpose with limits and shadows. The journey would not be as simple as I had once believed, and I knew that to be an effective guide, I would have to confront not only the darkness of others, but also my own. And a new feeling began to rise within me, the fear that my own shadow might resurface, dragging back the memories I most wanted to forget. The routine of being an invisible guide had given me a sense of purpose, a rhythm. I felt lighter, fuller. The lives of others with their struggles and triumphs were now my own, and I felt part of something greater. But the illusion of being a detached observer was brutally shattered. My journey was not only about others, it was about the shadows I had left behind. My mission was a mirror, and at some point, I would have to face my own reflection. The encounter that broke me came on a cold autumn afternoon. I was walking through a park when I felt a new wave of sorrow. Its source was a young woman sitting on a bench, her phone in hand. Her pain was not loss, but a deep frustration and guilt. She stared at the screen with a gaze that was a mixture of anger and helplessness. When I drew near to offer my presence, her pain did not merely touch me, it consumed me. And like a lightning strike, a memory I had locked away burst open. It was not just a recollection. It was as if my consciousness had been transported back in time, into my own living room. I was no longer a shadow. I was myself, Evelyn, 29 years old, phone in hand, staring at my mother's face on the screen. I was in the middle of an argument, her voice trembling with worry. She wanted to see me, wanted me to go to her country house. I, with the arrogance of youth and the pressure of work, was impatient. "I can't, Mom. I have a million things to do. Why don't you understand?" The words rang cold, even in my memory. I relived her look of disappointment, the sadness that needed no words, and I felt the guilt gnawing at me. The last time I saw her was in that call. The world around me dissolved. The young woman on the bench, the dry leaf drifting in the air, the laughter of a child, all faded from focus. I was trapped in my own memory, in the echo of that moment. My mission, my purpose, all vanished under the crushing weight of my failures. I felt like a specter inside a scene from my past, unable to change the words I had spoken. The pain of my mother, which I relived in that instant, was the same pain the young woman on the bench felt in her argument with hers. I was no longer a guide, but a prisoner of my own past, reliving my greatest regrets. My concentration broke. I could no longer project myself into the young woman, for my own torment was too strong. I tried to withdraw, but the weight of the memory pinned me in place, forcing me to relive it. I felt a physical pain, a tightening in my chest I had not felt since the day I died. My gift was a curse. I was being punished for my omissions, for postponing life. Every soul I tried to help was a reflection of myself. The inner conflict I had feared materialized. I could no longer hide behind my purpose. I could no longer be only the guide. My own humanity, my imperfection, was now the greatest threat to my mission. How could I lead others to the light if my own shadow consumed me? The only thing left was to cling to the young woman's pain, to try to transform it, but my own sorrow was a noise that drowned out every signal. I, who had left life with a void in my soul, now felt it filled with pain. The pain of others and my own, entwined in a net of guilt and regret. I knew my journey would not be a succession of triumphs. I would have to face my own past. And the final trial would not be a confrontation with an external enemy, but with my own inner self. The weight of my mother's memory was a burden I could no longer ignore. I, who thought myself a detached guide, was bleeding with emotion. The pain of regret gnawed at me, and for the first time since I had returned to Earth, I felt paralyzed. I stopped walking, hovering on the sidewalk while life went on around me. The vision of my mother's face haunted me, and guilt was a cold shadow clinging to my soul. How could I be a light for others if my own light was so obscured? My mission demanded neutrality, but I was anything but neutral. The fear of being a broken mirror consumed me. I feared that when projecting into other souls, I would not reflect their light, but my own darkness. That I might, without meaning to, make them feel worse, contaminate them with my guilt and my pain. The being of light had told me my capacity to feel was my tool, but now it felt like my greatest weakness. I was walking a razor's edge between compassion and self-destruction. Helping others now seemed like a way of punishing myself, of forcing me to relive my mistakes through theirs. To test this new reality, I dared to approach another encounter. This time, a couple in a heated argument. Their pain was not about omission, but about words spoken. The man was full of anger, the woman, of hurt. When I projected myself, my intention was clear: to calm the anger, to soften the hurt. But my own emotions seeped into the current. The echo of my argument with my mother, the rage I felt at not having more time, the suffocating helplessness, all of it became noise in my signal. Instead of reflecting their light, I reflected my own chaos. Their quarrel intensified, voices rising, and for a moment I saw fear in the woman's eyes. Not fear of the argument, but a fear from somewhere deeper, a fear that felt like my own projection. I withdrew, shaken by what I had done. I had failed. My emotion, so powerful, had become poison. I was no longer a guide. I was an obstacle. The mission that once gave me purpose now seemed impossible, unless I could somehow free myself from my past. I spent the following days in painful introspection. I hid in the shadows, refusing to approach any soul. With every person who passed, I felt their pain, but pulled away, afraid of what my soul might reflect. I no longer knew who I was. Was I Evelyn, the repentant ghost, or the guide the being of light had told me I was? The line between the two blurred with every moment. The resolution came on a cold night, when the city was blanketed in heavy fog. I was seated atop a building, staring at the city lights, when I realized the truth. I could not rid myself of my past. It was part of me, part of my story, part of what made me who I was. My pain was not a weakness. My pain was the source of my compassion. It was my understanding that life is finite, that words can wound, and that opportunities do not return. My mission was not to be a perfect mirror, but a broken one, because in knowing darkness, I could reflect light more honestly. I rose with a new determination. I would no longer try to suppress my emotions. I would embrace them. My guilt, my sorrow, my regrets. I would use that energy as fuel for my mission. I would be a guide who understood what it meant to be human, what it meant to be imperfect. And with this new acceptance, I knew my final trial would not be in helping others, but in helping myself. I would have to confront the hardest person of all, the one tied to my own death. I knew the day would come. My journey as a guide, with all its lessons and sorrows, had prepared me for a final encounter. It would not be with a soul on the edge of crisis, but with the one bound to my own. The presence I felt amid the chaos of the city was not sadness or anger, but a guilt so crushing I could feel its weight as though it were a physical burden. It was an echo of my own pain. I followed the sensation, weaving through the crowd, until I found him in a dark alley. The man sat on the ground, his back against cold brick, his face buried in his hands. I recognized him. He was the driver of the other car, the face I saw in my last memory, the man who survived. His name, I knew through my new awareness, was Arthur. His life had not ended, but dragged on through a year of torment. He had not been physically injured in the crash, but the wounds in his soul were far too deep for any surgery to mend. I did not see him as a villain. He was only a victim of a tragic accident, a man whose life had been permanently scarred by my death. His pain was a labyrinth of regret. I did not need to project myself to know what he was thinking. He replayed the accident in his mind over and over, like a horror film. The headlights he did not see, the horn he did not hear, and the moment someone's life unraveled before his eyes. He carried his guilt like a stone tied around his neck, heavier with each passing day. In life, I would have felt anger. The man who caused my death, who stole from me the chance to make amends. But death and my mission had taught me what life never could. That compassion is the only force capable of dissolving pain. I was not there to confront him, but to offer what he needed most: forgiveness. And I knew the purest form of forgiveness does not come from without, but from within. I drew closer. I did not care about being a shadow. I simply focused all my consciousness, all my compassion, all my understanding into a single point: his heart. I was not there to take revenge. I was there to show him that his guilt was not a curse, but a wound that longed to be healed. I projected my own sorrow, my own regret, so that he would feel he was not alone. And then, suddenly, he felt it. He lifted his head, and his expression was not of surprise, but of profound, overwhelming relief. It was as if the stone on his chest, carried for so long, had shattered. He looked around, his eyes full of tears, but he did not see me. He only felt a soft presence, a silent whisper telling him it was not his fault. I did not speak the words, but he knew them. I did not forgive him. I helped him forgive himself. I used my pain to heal his. The climax was not a scream or confrontation, but the silence of a soul finally finding peace. He collapsed in tears, not of despair, but of grief released. He wept for me, for himself, for the tragedy that had bound us. And I, in my ethereal state, wept with him. I was forgiving myself, forgiving my death, my lost time, my omissions. My journey had not been in vain. My death had a purpose. He rose, wiping his tears, and looked up at the sky. He did not have all the answers, but his soul, once a hollow shell, was now filled with a fragile new hope. He turned and walked out of the alley, and I knew he would never be the same. And I, who had returned to Earth as a ghost haunted by my past, was now free. The weight in my chest dissolved, and a peace I had not felt since before my death washed over me. My journey of redemption had never been only about others, but about my own soul. And the final trial had shown me that compassion is the key to freedom. After walking away from Arthur, what washed over me was not exhaustion, but a peace that was almost a form of light. The weight I had carried since my first breath as a ghost, the burden of my omissions and regrets, had dissolved. I was no longer a soul haunted by my past, but a consciousness freed by it. My redemption did not come from erasing what I had done or left undone, but from accepting that my life, with all its flaws, had given me the ability to connect with Arthur's pain and transform it. And it was in that instant that I understood the true nature of my mission. The being of light had not chosen me to be a perfect angel, a flawless mirror reflecting only beauty. It chose me to be a guide because I was, at my core, a broken human. My role was not one of judgment or salvation, but of pure, selfless, and above all, imperfect compassion. My own pain, my own tears, were the language through which I reached lost souls. My fragility was my strength. I began to see the world differently. The souls I encountered were no longer cases seeking help. They were complex beings, carrying a labyrinth of light and shadow within. The bitterness I had felt in the man at the bar was not the end of his story. It was only a layer, a shield he had built against the world. And I knew that if I approached him again, not with the intent to erase his shadow, but with the simple offer of a presence that does not judge, I could perhaps touch his light. My own journey had become the map of my mission. I had passed through crises of identity, of pain, of guilt. I had failed, regretted, and forgiven myself. And now I could offer the same chance to others. Redemption, I realized, was not a grand act, but a series of small steps. The decision to rise after a fall, to forgive a failure, to embrace what life gives, even when what it gives is pain. My death, which had once seemed so empty of meaning, was now the starting point of my true life. I was not a tragedy, but a beacon. The peace surrounding me was proof I was on the right path. It was a peace born of understanding, of acceptance. I no longer feared reliving my memories, because they were no longer chains but lessons. My mother, my career, my omissions, all of it had shaped me into the guide I needed to become. I, who had left life with a void in my soul, now felt whole. My journey, which began as a search for purpose, had led me to a simple truth. Purpose is not something we find, but something we create. And my creation was to offer compassion, one act at a time, one soul at a time. The path of redemption had no end. It was eternal. And with this new wisdom, I knew my mission was not temporary. It was my new existence. My journey as a guide had transformed me into something more. I was ready to embrace my role. I was ready to be a guardian. The acceptance of my mission was not an act of submission, but the culmination of a journey of redemption. I was no longer Evelyn, the ghost haunted by her past. I was the guardian, a formless consciousness existing for the sake of others. My life as a guide had no end. It was my new state, a constant flow of purpose. I was no longer seeking redemption. I had become redemption itself, a reflection of compassion in a world that so desperately needed it. My perception of the world shifted once more. I no longer saw only the beauty or the pain of the souls who passed by. I saw the fabric that bound them together, an invisible web of intertwined stories. The laughter of a child could be the relief an old man needed. The kindness of a stranger could be the spark that lit hope within a lost soul. I, who had once been nothing but a footnote in the city's story, was now the entire symphony. I no longer felt invisible, for my new vision allowed me to see the light dwelling in every being, and my role was simply to help that light shine. I laid aside the attachment to my past. The memory of my mother was no longer a wound to be healed, but a source of love I could use to help other mothers and daughters. The guilt of my death was no longer a burden, but the wisdom that allowed me to help others forgive themselves. My story was my tool, my vulnerability, my strength. I was the very definition of what it meant to be human, and my mission was to honor that humanity, even in my absence of form. The loneliness that had accompanied me at my awakening in the plane of light had dissipated. I was not alone. I was part of something greater, a network of silent guides moving across the earth, offering what was needed. I felt the presence of others like me, souls who had found their purpose in eternity. We did not communicate with words, but with echoes of intention. A web of compassion uniting the visible and the invisible world. The path of redemption was not a destination, but a journey. And I, who had left life with a farewell, had returned for an infinite hello. There was no more fear, no more sorrow, only the stillness of a soul that had found its place in the universe. My story did not end the moment my body stopped. It had only just begun. My final vision is of the city at night. The lights flickering, the movement of people, the stories of love and loss unfolding. I move among them, a shadow, a breeze, a ghost. I am the guardian, I am Evelyn, and I am eternally free.